let's get started. Today, we're going to be talking about Universal Dashboard from start to finish. So how many here have actually played with Universal Dashboard? Decent amount. How many people have heard of Universal Dashboard? Cool. All right. Sweet. So we're going to really get into it. I've talked to a lot of people that are like, why not just use Grafana? I'm like, whoa, there's a lot more going on here. So that's what I want to kind of show off. So I'm going to go through all my slides. Oh, there it is. Demo time. All right, so I actually am going to do this entire presentation inside Universal Dashboard. Let's just make sure this didn't break like it does sometimes. All right, so let's switch from PowerPoint to UD. So this is actually running PowerShell Universal Dashboard in a PowerShell prompt. And I used to have a joke with my coworkers that was the more cats that you have in your presentation, the luckier you're going to get, and sacrifice them to the demo gods, right? So that's why I have streaming cat GIFs at the first page here. So just a little bit about me. That's me in Germany enjoying a beer. I am a 6-time Microsoft MVP in Cloud and Data Center. I was a PowerShell MVP back when that was a thing, so I've been around PowerShell a long time. Kind of more recently, I'm a business owner, so I started my own little side company called Iron Man Software. Produce things like PowerShell Pro Tools and Universal Dashboard. I'm also a software architect during the day at StealthBits Technology, so we do a lot of like threat analytics and threat detection, that kind of thing. And I'm also an endurance athlete, so I'm a 2-time Ironman triathlon finisher, so I like punishment, apparently. I live out in Haley, Idaho, so it's actually not too far from here. They used to call it Haleywood in the 90s because Bruce Willis and all those guys would hang out there, but a lot of them have moved on. But I really like it because of the view. It's actually very gorgeous out there, so it's not just potatoes. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Universal Dashboard because it's a lot more exciting than me. So my tagline is kind of like create beautiful websites with PowerShell, but that evolved from create beautiful dashboards with PowerShell, and now it's becoming more like create web apps with PowerShell. So it originally started as just a dashboarding tool, so making charts and tables and grids and all that kind of stuff. But since then, it's kind of moved on. People are asking for more stuff. They wanted to be able to interact with it. They wanted to take user input and like execute PowerShell scripts. And since it has its own web server, they wanted to be able to use REST APIs, all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of what we're going to get into today, are all those little bits and pieces. So if you look at my navigation bar here on the left, that's kind of our agenda. So wish me luck. So Universal Dashboard is built on some kind of like core technologies that you might have heard of, may not have heard of if you're not a developer necessarily. Kind of the web server component is ASP.NET Core. So that's Microsoft's web server. They also have things like page rendering libraries and that kind of stuff built into ASP.NET Core. So it's kind of like an umbrella for a bunch of different web technologies outside of Microsoft and .NET Core. What UD uses it for is the ability to stand up a web server inside PowerShell and then do all the routing that you would expect from any HTTP web server. On the front end here, I'm using a JavaScript library called React. So React is built by Facebook. And the idea here is that when you look at a website, it makes HTML, which is pretty much XML. And that is considered the document object model for the page. And the document object model is slow to update and make changes to. So what Facebook did is they created this JavaScript library that has a virtual DOM, which allows the React engine to update the page kind of intelligently without actually having to deal with the DOM directly all the time. So that kind of gives you better performance when you're doing crazy JavaScript things, which UD does a lot of, which I'll kind of get into. The look and feel of Universal Dashboard is based on Material Design, which is a design concepts by Google. So they actually have this huge document about how you're supposed to make your pages look when you're using the Material Design concepts. So I'm using a JavaScript library that provides that. And we're going to actually be moving to a new JavaScript library soon that actually provides even more controls. And then finally, the whole reason that I'm standing here is that this entire thing is run by PowerShell. So you just have to interact with PowerShell to actually stand up websites like the one that you're looking at right now. And yeah, so you pretty much lay out your controls, and you provide data via PowerShell. So that means you can interact with your existing PowerShell modules to not only create charts and grids and tables and stuff, but also invoke your PowerShell functions or modules to make modifications in your environment. Onboard people in HR, add people to Active Directory or Exchange, that kind of thing. So that's all possible. Some other neat facts. It's built on PowerShell Core, or .NET Core, so it runs in PowerShell Core and PowerShell v5.1 as well, which means that you can kind of host it anywhere. It runs on Windows, Linux, and Mac. You can host it on the command line, which is what I'm doing right now inside VS Code. There's a service that's included with the module when you install it from the gallery, so you can stand up a Windows service. You can host it in Azure and IIS. There's a web config included, so if you want to host it that way, you can, which a lot of people still use IIS for this. I've seen people spin it up in Docker containers, so there's actually some documentation by one of the guys at Microsoft on how to stand up UD in a Docker container, in a Linux Docker container. And finally, I've actually managed to stand it up on a Raspberry Pi running Raspberry and Linux, which is pretty cool. So I actually integrated it with some home automation stuff, and then I had a dashboard that I could poke at on a tablet. So pretty neat. So what we're going to look at today are some controls. So text boxes, charts, grids, that kind of thing. I'll go over some of the basic controls. I'm not going to dig into every control because you guys would all mass exit probably. But yeah, so we're just going to look at some of that kind of stuff, and I'll show you where to get some information on what kind of controls you can use to build your dashboards. On the left-hand side here, I'm talking a little bit about the REST APIs. So has anyone used Polaris before? Yeah, a couple of you guys. So it's similar to that, where you can kind of create a REST endpoint that you can call from any system that can talk over HTTP. So it doesn't have to just be PowerShell. You could use invoke REST method, invoke web request to communicate with these APIs, but you could also use commands like curl, that kind of thing, from any heterogeneous system sort of thing. A couple other interesting tidbits. It's got built-in authentication if you're using the Enterprise Edition. So it supports OAuth over Microsoft, Twitter, Google, and Facebook, as well as Azure AD and Active Directory and IIS, and then some Forms authentication if you want to do that. So I'll show a little bit of that. My new favorite toy is this advanced customization. So I spent a lot of time with Universal Dashboard the last couple months making it so that you can bring in pretty much any React control into Universal Dashboard. So people are always asking for new controls or adjusting how the existing controls work, that kind of thing. So I'll show you guys how we can extend the Universal Dashboard ecosystem in terms of new controls, and kind of really reactive pages. So actually, this example right here is using technology called WebSockets to communicate between two different browsers, and I built a chat platform with Universal Dashboard. So it actually stores the chat messages up in Postgres database, and then you can communicate between two people just in Universal Dashboard. All right, finally, Community Edition is 100% free. So it's all open source and up on GitHub. And yeah, so you can pull that down and play with it now. It has pretty much 95% of the stuff I'm showing off today is in that. So you can build all kinds of tools without ever having to pay anything. All right, so let's talk about some core concepts of Universal Dashboard. And we're going to look at lots of code. Is that large enough? People in the back, that's good. All right, sweet. Thank you. All right, so Universal Dashboard is kind of composed of several different, maybe several, tons of different pieces. But the most basic kind of high-level piece that you're going to use are dashboards. So a dashboard, you can kind of think of it as a web server that you're running. And the dashboard itself, the definition of that dashboard actually controls what you see on the screen. So You can start a dashboard per port because it's actually starting up a new dashboard per port. So Windows will only let you, list it on that port once. So that's what is happening here. So you can use the command start UD dashboard to actually start your dashboard. To actually create your dashboard, you're going to use the new UD dashboard commandlet. And that allows you to do things like pass in multiple pages. You can have a single page dashboard if you want. Give it a title. And there's a whole host of configuration options that you can give here. Colors, custom scripts and style sheets, all that kind of stuff. In this case, I'm actually using a single page, but I could have multiple pages here. And then you use the new UD page commandlet to actually create those pages. So you can specify a name, an icon, which will appear in the navigation, and then the content of this particular dashboard. So this page is just using some basic controls like a heading, which if you've ever used HTML is like H1, H2, H3 tags, so it just kind of makes larger text. You can use icons. So Universal Dashboard actually has the Font Awesome icon library built in, so I think there's something like 1,800 icons you can use. And then you can do things, standard HTML stuff that you expect. New UD button, new UD image, that kind of stuff. Another concept that people kind of run into right away is like how to lay stuff out on your dashboard. So I'll get really into this in a little bit, but right now, just kind of the basic concept is that you can put controls on your page and lay them out in a certain fashion. Universal Dashboard has a 12-column layout system, which means that you can put up to 12 controls next to each other, and then those controls can take up X of those columns. So a control could be 3 out of the 12 or 4 out of the 12 columns. And then there's some commandlets I'll get into about how to lay out your controls. Another one that I thought I'd bring up right away, it'll make a little more sense when we get into it, but people stumble on this like almost immediately when they start playing with Universal Dashboard, is there is the idea of content versus endpoints. Content being static content, and an endpoint is actually called when the page is loaded. So in this example here, I have a new UD column that has static content on the top, and it's creating a card that's outputting a random value. When I actually execute this script, that's when that will happen. On the bottom here, I have a different column, but in this case, it's actually specifying an endpoint script block, and that will actually execute when the user visits your page, which makes it a lot more dynamic. So you could refresh data from somewhere, or have the user input something, and then it would show up on the page, that kind of thing. So we'll get into a lot of that customization. So I'll just show off how this dashboard looks, just so you have a little feel for some of these general concepts. So you can see there's the controls that I called out, my icon. If you can kind of see that little rocket ship, I should have made it bigger. And then this button, an image, and then here's that 12-column layout system. So I just used new UD layout and made it 12 columns wide. And then on the bottom here is the example of content versus endpoint. So this content starts with 385. The endpoint starts with 123. If I were to reload this page, you can see this one still starts with 385, and the one on the right is now 137. So it actually, when the page loaded, it went out, it called the PowerShell script, and repopulated the data on this page. So that's kind of how you build dashboards in general. But I'm going to show you some examples of some of the controls you can use. So if you go to poshud.com, there's actually this demo dashboard that's running. And this is actually, if you use start UD dashboard to specify a port and no other parameters, this dashboard will pop up for you locally. And that provides you with a little example of a universal dashboard. But one handy thing is like if you click on the navigation, it actually has examples of a bunch of the different controls. So admittedly, I've done a bad job of keeping this up to date. But there are still a lot of the basic controls that you will see in this session here. So for example, here's some examples of buttons. It's got the PowerShell script below, and then it has the example of what that looks like in Universal Dashboard. So you can do buttons with icons, floating buttons. I don't know what happened to my flat button. It's there, but you can't see it. That kind of thing. As well as charts, which I'm going to get into just in a sec, because a lot of people want to make charts. So some examples of charts, auto-reloading charts, so they can refresh on an interval, that kind of thing. custom colors, multiple data sets where you have different types of data intertwined with each other, that kind of thing. So I definitely recommend going out and checking out some of these controls. I promise I will update this with all the controls. What is actually a little bit more extensive is the documentation. So if you just go to docs.universal-dashboard or universal-dashboard.io, there's a whole bunch of different components with examples, that kind of thing. So definitely check that out. That actually includes a lot of the information that I'll be going over today, more than just the controls. But yeah, so definitely go and check that out. So let's actually start going through and building some controls in Universal Dashboard. So I went through some of that. I'm going to talk a little bit about visualizations first. So the idea with visualizations is that I want to see data in a chart or counter, that kind of thing. And this is kind of where Universal Dashboard started. I just wanted to make it so that people could collect data from their environment and show examples of that data running in a dashboard. So let's just kind of dig into what this kind of looks like. So I have a new UD page. I kind of talked about that before. This is my visualizations page. For some reason, I gave it the beer icon. I don't know why, but and then I'm creating a new row that has a column in it. In this case, the column size is 12, meaning that it stretches across the entire page. That's what I want to happen. Inside the content for that column, I am creating a new UD counter, and I want to display the number of activities that I've done per month. So this morning, I could not get my Strava API calls to work. They rate limited me, which was cool. So I frantically made a JSON file to do this instead. So the Strava is like Map My Ride or whatever. It kind of tracks your activities, so running or biking or swimming or whatever. So I did have a Strava API wrapper that used invoke web requests to call out to their service and that kind of thing, and it returns JSON, and then you can pretty much put it in something like Universal Dashboard. But instead, I have this JSON file that I created by hand. But it works, hopefully. All right, so we're going to start up this dashboard. One feature that I'm using of Universal Dashboard for this presentation is the auto-reload feature. So if I make modifications to this dashboard script, what it's going to do is it's actually going to update the dashboard automatically. So it will update the dashboard kind of on the server side, and then it sends a message down to the client side to say, hey, refresh the browser. So I will admit it's not perfect. So you might see me doing some refreshing, but it's a little bit better than like starting and stopping your dashboard all the time. So we'll go to the visualizations page. So OK, this is kind of the example of a super basic counter. I titled it activities per month. I told it to stretch across the entire page. And then I'm just outputting a number. So you can do things like format that number, to have commas or decimal points, that kind of thing. I put a little icon in the background. I don't know if you can see that little bike watermark there, that kind of thing. So sometimes you'll see this on like a homepage dashboard where they'll have a bunch of different counters up at the top. So a couple things to note here is that new UD counter actually uses the endpoint parameter. So that means every time this page loads, it actually is running a PowerShell script to get that data. So you can dynamically get that data from whatever system you're talking to output that count. It's not just statically happening right when I run this script. And then inside here, all I'm really doing is I'm calling getContent on that JSON file I was talking about, and then counting the number of objects that I had in that JSON file. And that's what ends up in my counter here. So that's pretty straightforward. Another example of something that I can do is a table. So people always kind of want to like output stuff as a table. So if I wanted to see that data that I just put in that counter as a table rather than just a number, this is kind of what you would do. So there's the new UD table commandlet, and you title it just like the other one. You specify some headers. That's kind of what appears in the top of the table. And again, it has an endpoint. So again, this is going to be called when the page loads and load this data dynamically. So I'm reading from my JSON file. I'm then calling for each object to format that data. So you can just use regular PowerShell script here to kind of format what ends up in my table. So type's just type. I'm not going to format that. The date I'm actually going to turn into a date time. So the date time kind of automatically formats itself when you output it to the as a string. Distance will just be distance. Moving time was in seconds. So I'm converting that from seconds to a time span object, which then again will be formatted nicely when it ends up on my table. And then finally, I have a link. So I can nest other UD controls inside my table. So I've seen people put buttons and links and icons, that kind of thing. So this allows you to kind of customize that. And all this data is coming from my activities object. So you can see here that I'm linking out to the actual activity out on Strava. So my auto reload worked. Now you can see that I have a table with all my activity, or the last 10 activities that I did. So I did some running out here, that kind of thing. It's formatted the date and the time into something that's readable, and then you can click on the view button, and it actually opens it up in Strava, that kind of thing. So tables are cool. There's also the idea of, or there's also a grid control, and the grid control is a little more dynamic. So the table is static, and you just see what you get, kind of thing. With the grid control, you actually end up with sortable columns. You can page, so it shows 10 by default, or you can page through, as well as filter, so you can filter the records. So if you have a lot of stuff that you want to show, you can actually use the grid control. I think I have an example of that in a little bit. All right, so that's a table. Let's look at a chart. So Universal Dashboard uses Chart.js, which is a chart library. So it's not re-implementing all this stuff. But I'm pretty much pulling packages from what they call Node Package Manager to do this. I once heard that Node Package Manager is like the best copy and paste ever or whatever. So that's pretty much what I'm doing here. But yeah, I'm using Chart.js to now build a chart in PowerShell. So again, I'm just getting my Strava data. This time, though, I'm grouping it by the type property, so that I actually want to show a bar chart where it shows running versus biking, like how many hours did I spend doing those things this month. And then I'm going to, again, kind of format them in a way that Chart.js expects. So type and time. So I'm summing all the moving time for that particular activity, and then I'm outputting it via outUD chart data. That ends up like this. So now I have a chart built on just my PowerShell script. And you can see that if you hover over this stuff, it tells you the values that you put into that chart, that kind of thing. So similarly, you can easily use other charts. So new UD chart supports things like pie charts and line charts and all that kind of stuff. So if I wanted to create a pie chart instead of a bar chart, all I have to do is specify the type parameter. So it's like a similar exercise of getting my activities, grouping them by a certain property, and then allocating the data in some way. So in this case, I'm doing distance rather than time. And what this should yield, if it loads, is a bar chart. So all I had to really do is change the type property, and then you kind of end up with a different chart. So additionally, colors are customizable. You can do things like border colors and background colors and that kind of thing. And you just kind of specify that on this outUD chart data commandlet. All right. Finally, I want to show off a couple other controls. I'm not going to get too into this because a lot of the stuff is on the documentation, but I just want you guys to know that they exist. So new UD monitor is a little different than new UD chart. It automatically updates based on time. So in this case, new UD monitor is going to check the CPU usage via getWMI object of the Win32 processor class. And then it's just going to output that monitor data to the screen. But it automatically updates every second, or I think second or 3 seconds or something like that. So then you kind of have a rolling chart that you kind of would expect from like Grafana or something like that. And then another concept that is in new UD chart is the idea of multiple data sets. I kind of showed this off when I was going through some of the documentation on poshud.com. So I can pretty much group my objects by 2 different types of data, and then output those as 2 different types of data sets. So in this example, I'm getting the Win32 logical disk class, and then for each one of those, I'm summing the size and free space for each disk. And then I output those as data sets, and then you'll actually end up with 2 bars for every drive. So now if I go back here, you can see on my left-hand, or this CPU usage on the left here, it's updating automatically with the CPU usage on my machine. On the right-hand side, you can see that I'm almost totally out of space on my C drive. All right. So yeah, that's just some other charts that you can get into there. In addition to Chart.js, there are also some other types of charts. There's another chart library involved here called Nebo Charts. These charts kind of behave similarly. Again, I'm not going to go super through this code because it's all documented, but I'll just kind of talk about it a little bit. This top one's a Nebo chart heat map. So you kind of just pass in the data that you would like, and it kind of makes a grid. And that allows you to kind of visualize your data in a different way. So as you can see, my data up here is by country and then by type of food. And then I'm putting a random value in the actual value for the type of food for each one of these countries. And that will create the heat map chart. And then on the bottom here, I'm using a calendar chart. So the calendar chart is the GitHub activity chart that you see, where it changes color based on how many activities you've done for your commit history kind of thing. That's what the Nebo chart for calendar is. It actually changes color based on the value relative to the other values in that calendar. So here's the heat map. Up at the top, you can see it's by country and then by food on the X and Y axis. And then this is what the calendar chart looks like. So the Nebo charts offer more chart possibilities than just Chart.js does. So that's why those are in there, so you can do kind of cool stuff like this. And they have color palettes built in and all that kind of thing. So unlike Chart.js, which will be this weird blue color by default, these guys actually have color palettes built in. You can select your color palette, that kind of thing. And then it automatically picks those colors for you. All right. So that's kind of what I wanted to show in terms of visualizations. So that's kind of where Universal Dashboard started. It was oh, let's make a bunch of cool controls. And then I posted it on Reddit, and everyone's why not just use Grafana? It's oh no, what have I done with my life? So then I started building more stuff into this, and that's where we are today. All right. So that's pretty cool. Yeah, you can kind of use PowerShell through and through to collect all this data, put it onto your pages, that kind of thing, via visualizations. But you might want to lay that out in a specific fashion. So the easiest way to lay stuff out in Universal Dashboard is using the new UD layout control. This allows you to specify the number of columns you'd like your layout to be for Universal Dashboard. In this case, I want a 4-column layout. So I can just plug a bunch of different controls into the content of that new UD layout, and then it'll actually automatically calculate the rows and columns for me. So then if I go back to my page here, go to my layout page, you can see I have a 4-column layout now. So I didn't have to worry about kind of doing the whole row and column thing. It just kind of automatically calculates that for you. So if I wanted to switch this to a 3-column layout, and it'll attempt to reload, eventually there. So now you can see that it's a 3-column layout instead of a 4-column layout. So that's pretty much the easiest way to kind of lay things out in Universal Dashboard. But what I've found is most people want more control than that. So you can use new UD row and column to do that. New UD row, as it states, it creates a row on the page. And then new UD column allows you to create a column on that page and specify the size of that column right in the new UD column commandlet. So I have a row with a column. The first one's size 4, and if you remember, we have a 12-column layout. So a size of 4 would be 1/3 of the page. And then I have another column that's size 2, and finally a column that is size 6. So I should have saved that a second. So now when that reloads, you can see now it's spaced out those columns according to the sizing that I gave it. So you can get a little more complicated in terms of that kind of layout. Another concept is the concept of offset. So if you want just like a blank spot somewhere, you can offset a column by a little bit. So this first column is going to be offset 2 of the 12 columns, and it's going to be a size of 4. So if we go to our page now, you can see that the column has just shifted over. So you have a lot of control when it comes to columns if you use new UD row and new UD column. One problem I found with these that people complain about a lot is nesting. You end up with a lot of nesting. So I can see trying to figure out good ways. And I'll show you a control that's coming in 2.4 that actually should make a lot of that easier. But one more thing I want to show is the ability to adjust by screen size. So it's a web app, so you might run it on your phone, you might run it on a tablet, you might run it on a desktop. So you want it to adjust that component based on screen size. So that's why there's a small size, a medium size, and a large size. If you specify just small size, it'll be that size on every screen size. But if you specify small size, medium size, and large size, it'll adjust based on your screen size. So if we go here, you can see I'm on a large screen right now, so it's taking up a small portion of the screen. But as I adjust this screen size, you can see this is like a tablet size, right? So now it's taking up a lot more of the screen. And then if I get really small, it'll actually snap all the way out and take up the full width of the screen. So it would look better on a phone. And then finally, kind of what I suggested before, is there's a new control coming in Universal Dashboard 2.4. It's actually there in the beta, and that's what I'm running right now, is 2.4 beta. And this control allows you to do layouts kind of outside of this nested structure that you end up with new UD row and new UD column. So this looks really ugly here, but kind of the idea is going to be that you'll be able to drag and drop stuff in the browser and resize it and everything like that, and it'll generate this crap behind the scenes. And then your layout then is less about you typing in PowerShell and more about you dragging and dropping it and making it look the way you want. So I have a new UD grid layout here. I'm passing in some JSON to put some default layout in there. And then I have a couple controls inside that layout. So now, hopefully this loads. So this is the grid layout. And I don't know if you can see there's a little handle at the bottom down here that I can kind of pull and resize. So now I can actually move my controls around. And the idea being you'll be able to save that back to PowerShell, and then you can kind of organize your stuff on the page without having to like nest a bunch of controls together and make it really sloppy. So yep, it's kind of the same thing that Grafana uses. Take that. All right, so those are kind of the basics of like setting up a dashboard. But let's talk a little bit about immediately what everyone wanted me to do after I released this was start creating inputs. Like, okay, we're PowerShell users. We want to take action. We want to build tools for people to actually go out and modify things in their environment. So that's where inputs have come into play. So let's command this. So the most basic version of an input is something like this. So there's the new UDInput commandlet. You give it a title, and then you give it an endpoint, which is invoked when the user clicks submit on that form. And new UDInput, what it can do is it can automatically generate forms based on param blocks. So a param block like this is something you'd see in like a function or an advanced function, something like that. And it has these 3 parameters in this example. The first one is like an undefined type, so it's just type of object, right? What UD will do in this circumstance is it will actually think, okay, I'm just going to put up a text box because I don't know what this is. Just let them type freeform into it. The second one here is a bool. So it could either be a bool or a switch parameter. And then what UD will do is it'll automatically create a text or a checkbox. So then the user can check that, and you'll get that data when this endpoint is invoked. And then finally here we have a system.dayofweek, which is a C# enum or .NET enum. And that has, obviously 7 values. And when it's an enum or it's a validate set attribute on the parameter, what it'll actually do is it'll create a drop-down list. So then you can kind of enforce that inside the UI. So that will reload, hopefully. Oops, I didn't get Nancy. All right, inputs. So there's your basic input. So it's got your text box that came from that param block. It's got my checkbox from the bool, which is a switch, and then it's got this drop-down where I can select the day of the week based on that enumeration. So it actually went out, found out what the values were for that enumeration, and then created that. Hello. And then what I'm actually doing is I'm using show UD toast. So if you look in the top right corner there, it pops up a toast, which is just like a little message inside Universal Dashboard. And you can see it's got all the values that I typed into new UDInput. So people have created, things to onboard users and, Active Directory, that kind of thing. I've seen all kinds of examples of stuff that you can do with new UDInput. You don't just have to show message boxes. But if you do, that's how you do it, is show UD toast. And UD toast is kind of cool because it has tons of parameters on how you want to make your toast look, like icons and themes and how long you want it to stay and if you want to click on it and it does something. So lots of cool stuff there. All right. Another way that you can kind of take action after the user inputs something is you can use new UDInput action. So with new UDInput, I'm creating a single parameter, what should I say? And then I'm using the new UDInput action commandlet to return different content. So the user enters some data, you return this different content. It replaces the actual input control with whatever you want from this content parameter of new UDInput action. So I'm just going to echo out what the user says via a heading tag. So hello world. And now you can see that it went out and it replaced that actual control with something. So I've seen people enter data in, and then they'll prompt for kind of confirmation from the user. So they'll output like a table or something like that. You're about to create this user in our environment. And that's what this is used for a lot. And then they could click continue, and then it would actually submit the action. So a good confirmation kind of thing. All right. So one thing that came up a lot was new UDInput errors. So you're taking in data from a user. Yeah, they say always validate your input. But what ended up happening was you ended up with all these like really messy scripts that you didn't really get good feedback to the user why something happened. It was just like, oh no, we got an error, or you'd have to do that replace content thing or pop up a message box. To make that experience a little bit better, what I did is I implemented the ability to use validate attributes in your param blocks. So in this case, it's validating the length of this text box, but you could do things like validating range, validating script blocks, so you could actually just execute script to ensure that that parameter is exactly what you want it to be before it ever actually hits this code here. And the way it does that is, as the user's typing, when they leave a field, it will actually go out, invoke the parameter validation, and then it'll return a message back to the user directly in the browser. So you do need to include this validate parameter for that kind of experience to happen, but once you do that, you can see I have a standard text box. The difference here is that my submit button is now disabled because it's not valid. I need to be between 1 character and 10 characters, that kind of thing. If I click on this text box and click away, it goes out and does the validation on Universal Dashboard in the server side, and then you can hover over this, and it's actually the exact error that you would get out from the command line about why that user can't submit this form. So I have a character length of 0, it's too short. If I type some stuff here and click off, you can see it went out, it did the validation, it's valid now, and now I can submit my form. All right. So if you want a little more customization when it comes to Universal Dashboard inputs, you can actually specify fields directly. So if you don't want to just not do that param thing, you can also use new UDInput Field. So that one benefit is you kind of have more control over what actually ends up on the user's page. But the other thing is that it also supports data types that are not supported by that param block syntax thing. So in this example, what I'm doing is I am using a file type of input field so that the user can actually upload a file to Universal Dashboard. And then this name needs to match this name in the param block. But what will happen is the user can upload a file to Universal Dashboard. It'll pass the contents of that file in through this param block as text, and then you can process that on the server. So I'm going to upload a CSV. I am just going to convert from CSV into some objects that I'm going to then output. And I'm going to pop up a modal, which is kind of just like a message box, like a Windows Forms message box kind of thing. And then I am going to set up a grid inside that modal with the CSV data. So this is, I'll show you, this is an example of a grid with sorting and searching and filtering. So let's reload that. So now you can see I have this input. I click this, it actually pops up my file browser. Click that. Now I'm going to upload this TechCrunch Continental USA CSV doc. I don't know, it's some document about startups getting funded or something. So now it actually went up, it uploaded that file, it processed with convert from CSV, it created a bunch of objects, and then it used show UD modal to pop up this modal with the grid inside it. So then, this is just the CSV data, more or less displayed in grid format. So some things with the grid, like I said, you can search it, you can sort on things, kind of thing, and then you can also page through stuff. So honestly, one of the biggest complaints about Universal Dashboard is this grid. So we're looking at using a better grid. But yeah, so it's kind of limited. Like that's the stuff that you can do. And it has some problems when you start getting really big data sets, that kind of thing. So we're looking at alternatives. And actually did a live stream about bringing in an alternative as a custom component, which I'll talk about in a little bit here. Yeah, so that's a custom input right there. All right. All right. Now let's talk a little bit about custom elements since I just brought that up. So like I said before, Universal Dashboard is really, really extensible. So at first I started with the concept that you can just kind of build any HTML and JavaScript-y thing directly in PowerShell. So that's where new UD element came from. So new UD element actually allows you to create arbitrary HTML tags inside Universal Dashboard. So in this example, what I'm doing is I'm saying new UD element with a tag of div, which is just kind of like a standard kind of container inside HTML. And then I'm specifying some attributes on it. So I'm going to specify the style. So I'm giving it some padding. I'm going to make the background color black, the font color white. And then within that div, I'm actually going to put in this text. So this is kind of different than using, there's another command that you can use called new UD HTML. And what that does is it actually generates HTML text and then shoves it into the React DOM, more or less. And that's less efficient than what is actually happening with new UD element. New UD element actually creates a React component with a bunch of kind of crazy features that have been built into UD that allow you to not only create like HTML like this, but it also allows you to create really, really, really dynamic websites because it listens over WebSockets, which I'm going to kind of show off and talk about in just a little bit. So this example here, like I said, just creates a div. So if we go to our custom elements page, you can now see that I have this div that's been padded a bunch. It's got a black background and white text. So that allows you to kind of create whatever HTML you want using new UD element. And if you actually look at Universal Dashboard, the actual module itself, what you'll see is a lot of the components that you're using are just really wrappers around new UD element. So this example here is the new UD icon. it's really just a PowerShell function or advanced function that specifies a bunch of things that you would expect from an icon, and then it outputs a new UD element. So an icon in HTML that uses like font awesome is an I tag, and then you just have to specify a bunch of different CSS classes and that kind of thing on it to produce that. So this file actually has a bunch of the different things or controls that you kind of use regularly, and they're really just wrappers around new UD element. So there was no need to like actually generate JavaScript for this. It just uses the new UD element to generate the HTML on the fly. So that's pretty cool. Let's go back here. So because you can kind of like generate all kinds of crazy stuff, here's an example of like nesting components. So I have an SVG tag, which is a scalable vector graphic tag, and it allows you to kind of draw stuff in HTML. So if you've ever used an SVG before, you know that XML kind of format. This is very similar to that, but you can put it right into HTML. So I'm creating an SVG tag, and I'm actually nesting another rectangle tag inside that SVG tag. Then I'm giving it some styles. I'm specifying sizing. I'm specifying like rounding the corners. Then I'm giving it some styles around the fill, the border, that kind of thing. So then you can actually end up with something like this, where it's an actual drawn image in there. So a lot of the chart libraries and stuff like that will actually generate SVG graphics directly in HTML, kind of like this. But you can do this all through PowerShell. All right. All right. So another concept kind of more recent to UD is the idea of bringing in custom JavaScript components. So one of the problems that I started running into with new UD element is it didn't fit every single thing that you ever wanted to do, kind of thing. And it also ended up being really slow because if you do a lot of new UD elements, it's got to send a lot of JSON back from the web server and then render all that stuff. Unlike a compiled React component, which is already on the client side, and you just need to specify some data, and then it spins it up. So I saw a lot of people building lots of stuff with new UD element, and then all of a sudden it was just crushing, their web server. It would download like a couple megabytes of JSON to build their dashboard, that kind of thing. So what I did is I made it a lot easier to actually bring in custom JavaScript components. So I actually did a stream about this on Twitch a little while ago that's up on YouTube. So if you really want to get into the fine-grained details about how this works, I step you through the entire process of building with this. But I'll just kind of show you a little rundown of what's going on here. So I'm actually using a new UD knob control. So this example is actually up on GitHub. So you can pull it down and put it in your dashboards right now. And the way this works is you actually just import a different module. So this module itself just comes down as that. And then you just import it into your session, and now it's available inside your Universal Dashboard as a control that you can use. So if we go over to the knob dashboard script, what you'll see here is that there's two things. There's more or less a PSM1 file that you can use to invoke new UD dashboard, and then there's the actual JavaScript file that was generated for this control. And then if you look in here, it does some registration stuff with UD to register that script, and then it exposes new UD knob as a function that you can call inside PowerShell. So that means that the Universal Dashboard ecosystem is kind of extensible. So I was hoping I'd wake up tomorrow and there'd be a bunch of cool controls that people built, but it still hasn't happened yet for some reason. But if we go out here, now you can see this is that knob control. So it dynamically loaded that JavaScript, and we just used the PowerShell. So that means that we can kind of extend the Universal Dashboard ecosystem without actually having to release new versions of Universal Dashboard. And what's kind of cool is if you actually go out and look at the JavaScript that's involved here, it's not that much because you can bring in these React components pretty easily, and then you end up with just like a light wrapper around something like this knob component. And it just pretty much passes all these properties from PowerShell all the way to JavaScript. And Universal Dashboard takes care of all that piping. So if you really want to nerd out in some JavaScript, go on ahead. All right, so that is my section on custom components. So like I said, there's PowerShell custom components with the UD element, as well as kind of JavaScript-based custom components. So I would say, like, if no one else is going to build these controls, I'm going to build some cool controls, and there'll be definitely more controls coming in the ecosystem that aren't packaged directly into Universal Dashboard. All right, so this is where I went a little crazy, and I maybe took it a step too far. It's like, I'm building the best UI framework ever. So when I built new UD element, one of the things that people were asking for is, like, I want to be able to, like, interact with this like a win form, right? I want to be able to have an on-clicked event handler that does this stuff, and then run some PowerShell script, just like I would with, like a win format. So that's where I started hooking in the ability to update elements dynamically from PowerShell. So in this example, I'm creating a new UD element tag, which is a div, and then just giving it the ID of placeholder. Then I am creating a button, and that button has an on-click event handler, kind of like you would with WinForms. And then when that button is clicked, I actually want to update the content of this placeholder. So that's where you use setUDElement. So setUDElement allows you to set things like the content and attributes of those controls. And this is where you can start to, like, produce, like, really dynamic websites with UD. And that's when I showed that example in the beginning of me building a chat room, I was using these types of commandlets. So let's go back here. Go to my dynamic interfaces. So if I click this button, you can see right above it, the text popped up. That, dude, you clicked the button. So what that did is I clicked that button, it communicated over HTTP to the web server, it executed some PowerShell script, and then when you call setUDElement, it communicates back over a technology called WebSockets back to the client browser. So lots of stuff happening right there, but yeah, it updated that text. That's cool. But you can do all kinds of stuff with this. You don't have to interact with the web page itself. You could do things like show toast, like I showed before, where it'll pop up little toast messages. So every time I'm clicking this, it's going up to the web server, it's executing PowerShell script, and then it's sending a message via WebSockets back to show a toast message. Hello. And then you can do things like modals, that kind of stuff. So I guess that's just another example that I put in here. Should have just done that. So you could do things like progress bars, that kind of stuff, if you were doing a long-running process, that kind of thing. All right, so that is kind of setting data. Additionally, what you can do is you can add items to elements. So if you have I have an element here that's a unordered list tag with an ID of a list of date times. I'm creating a new button, and when I click that button, what I want to do is I want to add new content to that unordered list. So I'm going to say add UD element, and then I'm going to use new UD element to create new list items to put into that list. So now if I click this, every time I click this, it's going to add a new date time. So this could be cool for generating a UI based on things that people are typing, that kind of thing. Yep, so that's just adding items to that list in HTML. Additionally, if I wanted to get rid of all the items in a particular control, I could use clear UD element to actually clear out the items in that parent control. So if I click that, I don't like dates, all those dates go away. So you can kind of compose really, really extensive UIs using this. And that's kind of what I did with the chat room, is I used add UD element. Anytime someone would enter a message, what it would do is it would call add UD element, put that message up in like a collection, and then additionally, it would go out to a SQL server and store that message in SQL so that when you reloaded the page, it still had those messages. All right. one thing people like to do is get data this way. So you can get data via new UDInput. It's a little simpler, I guess. But you can use get UD element to actually get data from other elements on the page. So if I use new UD text box and then give it an ID of text box, I can actually call get UD element ID text box in my onClick event handler to get that element's state. And then from there, I can update other controls. So this is kind of a complicated example because on the onClick, I'm making a request up to the server, executing some PowerShell script. When I call get UD event, it asks for the current state of that text box from the client. Then it calls set UD element to push some state back down to the dashboard. So did I not save this? Oh, there it is. So now I have this text box, and I should say hello. And then I click this, and it echoes that text. So it actually got that text from this text box and then sent it back and forth from the server and then updated the page with that information. So you can pretty much do whatever with this, and that's good and bad. I think it complicates things sometimes, and I'll talk a little bit about that when I talk about session state here in a sec. But yeah, that's kind of the way you can build dynamic interfaces. There's one other thing I actually want to talk about is a sync UD element. So sometimes you don't want to push a particular state. Your element might have an endpoint block that you just want to update again. So in this case, I have a new UD layout with 3 counters in it. Each one of those counters is going to output a cache value. So I'll talk a little bit about cache values, but just know that it's like it caches that on the server, and we can get that value and put it into our endpoints. In this example, what I'm going to be doing is I have a cache value, and I'm going to output it via each one of these counters. And then when I click this button, what I want to do is actually update that cache value with a new random value, and then I'll call sync UD element, which pretty much tells each one of these controls to update itself. So then what I ended up with, right now the cache value is 0. But if I click this, you can see what it did is it created a new random value, and then it said, hey, you 3 controls, update yourselves. So in this configuration, I've seen people do this all over the place, and usually it's for like filtering. So I have a bunch of filters that I want to do, and I have a bunch of charts that I want to update all at once when I modify those filters. So you click those filters, you call sync UD element, and then it updates all those controls based on the data that it's getting from the server. So that's one way to kind of, I guess, simplify some of this stuff. All right, so that's a good segue into cache and session variables. This is pretty quick. So there's 2 types of scopes that are not available in regular PowerShell that are available in Universal Dashboard. There's the session scope, and then there's the cache scope. So the session scope is only good for the current user's browser session. And I think if you like clear cookies or whatever, it will clear that value. And then the cache variable is good throughout Universal Dashboard. So there might be data that you want to cache for whatever reason and show on every user's dashboard. That's where you use a cache variable. It's good for like maybe an app token or a URL or something like that you're going to use throughout. A session variable, on the other hand, is something that you want to store just for that particular user. So if I go to my dashboard now, I don't have an icon. On the left, you'll see the cache. On the right, you'll see, or left, you'll see the session. On the right, you'll see the cache. If I increment this session, it should go. Oh no. Oh, well, I don't know why that's not working. Dun dun dun. All right, dang. That was going to be my demo there. But the idea would be, I'll have to figure out what's going on there. But the idea is that the session variable only persists for this user's session. So my demo would have been I was going to open an incognito window, and what you'll see is that the session itself will not will remain 0 on the incognito window, but the cache will be 9 because the cache persists across users, and the session is only user specific. So I don't know what happened there. All right, and one reason that you would actually use a session variable, or a cache variable more likely, is the ability to cache data that you are getting from some web service. So one thing I was talking about earlier is that this morning I realized that I got rate limited by Strava. And the reason was because every time I load my page, it was calling to the Strava API and making a call. Like if you have like 15 controls on there that you want to load data from the Strava API, anytime a user hits your website, it's going to execute that 15 times. So that really quickly will rate limit you. But one way to work around that, and one way to actually increase performance of your dashboard, is to avoid making those calls every time the page is loaded. And what I suggest for people, it's not always perfect because sometimes you want to filter based on what the user is selecting, that kind of thing. But for data that you want to kind of show to every single user, one way you can work around this is using scheduled endpoints. So UD has its own scheduler built in. And it allows you to kind of specify a scheduled endpoint that runs on an interval. So you can specify every 10 minutes, every 30 seconds, every hour. And it also supports cron schedules, that kind of thing. And then from there, you just use the new UDInput commandlet to pass in that schedule, and it will call this endpoint on that interval. So what I'm going to do here is instead of actually calling that get content raw Strava JSON convert from JSON every single time in all my script blocks, what I'm going to do is I'm going to call it on a background thread that runs every 10 minutes. So then whenever anyone hits my dashboard, rather than going out to Strava, it's just getting something from memory. And then the way you could do that, for example, the REST API call is just use cache activities. So I'm storing that in here, and then I'm using it down here. So now I just got to make sure that I have this endpoint set up. Yeah, I think I do. So now I should be able to use something like, let's actually just pop up a PowerShell window. It might be easier to see. It's a little bigger. All right. So now I should be able to use invoke REST method, HTTP localhost 999 API / what did I do? I think athlete.cache or something. Sorry, activity.cache. Activity cache. Wrong kind of cache. Ah, oh, dang it. What did I do wrong now? Oh, my demos are all falling apart. The world's crashing around me. Yeah, so I'm not sure why that didn't work. But it's funny. I did a demo. So what the heck? I did a demo very similar to this, and it didn't work then either. So, what's that? Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure. Well, yeah, but it should be calling over HTTP. Yeah. So I'm not exactly sure why that's. Wait, did I do invoke REST method? Weird. Okay, but it's weird because the cache variable itself has data in it. So you can actually check out these cache variables. It's kind of like active throughout. If I could type. Is it a different port? It's a good. I think I'm on 999. Yeah, I'm on 999. Live session debugging. Oh, you're right. It's activities. But it looks like the same for both of these, so I'm not exactly sure why. Oh, did I do activities? No, I did activities. What the heck? That's really weird. It's like I'm putting empty data out. Well, hopefully the rest of my REST API demos work. All right, so yeah, but that's the general concept is that you would cache that data, so then when you load your dashboard, it's actually a lot faster rather than calling the Strava API every time. Like reading from a file is not so bad, but going out and making web requests and all that kind of stuff can be slow. So that's kind of how I suggest you go is build out a scheduled endpoint and then store that data if possible, and then inside your dashboard actually use those cache variables rather than loading it every time. Oh, Well, no, because it's starting as objects. Oh, maybe I need to do that. Because now it's objects. I wonder if I did convert to JSON here. I don't know. I thought that would automatically convert. It's not quite loaded. Oh, yeah, there we go. Woo! All right. Cool. Good call. Yeah, right. All right, cool. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about security now. So like I said, Universal Dashboard has some security stuff built into it where you can actually create login pages. So let's actually add a login page to our dashboard that we've been looking at here. And there's a couple of different ways you can go about this. You're always going to be using new UD login page, but your authentication method is going to change. So kind of, I think I might eventually change this commandlet because now there's ways to configure this so that you never see the login page with like single sign-on for Active Directory and IIS, that kind of thing. But for now, you use new UD logon page to configure the authentication for the dashboard. Then you specify one or more authentication methods. So you can specify multiple OAuth methods. You can't really specify Windows form single sign-on with anything else, but other than that, you can kind of mix and match a little bit. In this case, what I'm actually doing is I'm doing forms auth. So with forms auth, you just specify an endpoint and then a param block that has a PS credential in it. When the user logs in, they will actually have to type in their credentials, and then you'll get that via this PS credential object right here. And then my super secure login page is always going to say success. So that's what happens here. But what you could do is you could have some call to an external service for whatever reason, and then determine whether or not this was a successful login, and include a message to the user, that kind of thing. And if it's success, you need to pretty much provide the username that user is then going to have throughout the session. And yeah, that's how you authenticate them. So let's actually see what that login page looks like. And you actually need to add that down here. So that's one of the parameters to new UD dashboard. So hopefully this works. So now that I added this login page, now I am presented with this rather than going to my dashboard immediately. So the user has to log in. If you did OAuth, you'd end up with some buttons like, log in with your Microsoft account, that kind of thing. Log in with Facebook, which is everyone's dream when they're logging in the Universal Dashboard, right? So we're going to actually log in with this user. So I'm going to log in as myself, specify whatever password since I'm not checking. And now when I log in, you can see that I have access to everything again. Little difference is that I have a sign out button now in the top left or top right corner. So I can sign out of there. So one other component of kind of the authentication and authorization stuff inside Universal Dashboard is the ability to use authorization policies as well as role-based access. So I actually have configured a authorization policy somewhere. I'm actually going to add this. So the other thing that you can configure on your login page is an authorization policy. So what an authorization policy does is it allows you to evaluate whatever criteria you want based on that user's login information, and then grant access to different resources on your dashboard. So I actually am checking, so this needs a little cleanup, admittedly, but claims principal is actually the object that ASP.NET Core provides, and it has a bunch of information about like the identity of the user. So in this case, this is the username, as well as things like claims. So a claim would be like a group membership or something like that. And if you do like 80 logins, those will automatically be populated by ASP.NET, and you can check group membership in something like this. So if you wanted to assign a user to a particular group and then grant them resources to a particular page in your dashboard, this is what you would do. Or similar to this. There's examples up on the forums of how to actually do this with Active Directory and then checking group membership. And then I am creating a page here, and this page has this authorization policy. So only the people that pass this particular claims or authorization policy will have access to this page. So if I log in with the administrator user, I'll see that page, and with any other user, I should not. So if I log in as Adam, you'll see on the left-hand side here, I don't have the settings page. It's not there. But if I log out, and I go to administrator and log in with him, I'll see now I have the settings page. So I can access the settings page, I can get the username and plop it into the dashboard, that kind of thing. So you could have, different pages for different types of users, that kind of thing. Additionally, when you do login page stuff like this, you always have access to that username. So if you wanted to customize the dashboard based on which user was logging in, you could go, grab different resources and format the page based on that. So that is a little bit about the security stuff. So there's a little bit more involved here. You can also do security for REST APIs. I'm not really going to get into that right now. It's all documented out there, and security is kind of boring, right? But yeah. So yeah, that's how you kind of create protected dashboards, sort of thing. Nope, it won't actually ever return that page. So, yep, it locks down both the viewing that page and then any endpoints that are on that page. So if you have different controls that scoop data for a chart or something like that, you won't be able to access those endpoints either. So. That's a good question. I don't know. I don't know of any examples off the top of my head aside from the ones that are probably old on the Iron Man or the Universal Dashboard one. So, but yeah, I could throw some examples up there of how to do this stuff. I'm going to put this whole presentation up there too. So, and also note that in 2.3.2 there's a bug in the authorization policy stuff. So it works great in 2.4, but in 2.3.2 it's a little wonky right now. All right, so we're going to get rid of this login page for now. And I'm going to show you guys some REST API stuff. I was really surprised when people wanted REST APIs out of Universal Dashboard because Polaris exists and all that kind of thing. But I spent a lot of time implementing this functionality, so I think people use it a lot. I know certain people only use this, which is kind of interesting as well. So what a REST API is, how many people here are familiar with a REST API? Okay. So right, you can call HTTP to get resources using things like invoke REST method. But what Universal Dashboard allows you to do is kind of the opposite of that, provide the REST API so that we can call things via invoke REST method or curl, that kind of thing. All right, so I have some data here. I've created a JSON file called data.json that includes a bunch of different objects. So they're just different users with their roles, and then I'm outputting them to a file. And then what I'm doing is I'm actually generating these REST APIs inside Universal Dashboard. So you can just call a new UDInput. You don't have to pass it to anything. I'm out nulling it so it doesn't fill up my screen. And you can actually just generate REST methods based on the URL and the method you provide. So the most simple one here is that I want to provide a user endpoint where I can get that list of users that I just put in that JSON file and then output it back to whoever's calling over HTTP. And typically in REST world, you'd use the get HTTP method for that, and that's what I'm specifying here. So when a user calls this, they're actually going to more or less invoke this get content call on the server. It's going to get that JSON file, and it's going to send it back through HTTP. So again, I'm going to open up a different window. And if I do HTTP localhost 999 API/user, you can see I got my objects back. And since I actually returned this as JSON, invoke REST method will automatically convert it to PS custom objects. So that's why it's all formatted nicely and that kind of thing. But what's neat is if I do something like open up CMD and, oh, you know what? I hope this is installed here. I don't know if it's actually on this laptop. Oh, it is. OK. So now I actually executed curl. So that's just curl.exe. And it's going to that particular URL and then returning the JSON that's actually returned from it. So you could integrate with whatever system you really wanted to because it's just talking HTTP and calling your PowerShell commandlets. So one thing I really want to do with this is I want to integrate with Swagger API or the Open API spec, which pretty much lets you document your APIs. And I don't know if you guys know what auto-rest is. It's just a PowerShell module that came out real recently that actually can take those open API docs and then generate PowerShell commandlets from it. So then you could have like a PowerShell thing generating PowerShell things that generates PowerShell things. It'd be pretty cool. Yeah. All right. Taking this a little step further, Universal Dashboard endpoints can do things like query string parameters and kind of variabilized routes. So this is what I would consider a variabilized route. So the way you denote that is with this little semicolon, and it says, like, I want this to be a variable in the route. So if you execute this particular REST API and you specify some value after here, it's going to get passed in through the param block, and then I can use that to do things later on. So in this case, I want to filter my user object. So I'm going to get the content, and then I'm going to filter on that username, and then I'm going to convert it back to JSON and send it out via my REST API. So then if I just put Adam after this, you'll see I just get that single one back. So it actually did that where object and everything. So not only can you get data, the other thing I guess I want to mention is you can do the same thing with query string parameters. So if you did something like role equals test, I don't have this hooked up right now, but if you did something like that, you could also add a role parameter in here, and you'd get that out in your endpoint. So then you could use it in there too. So you can have lots of different things you're filtering by. OK, so some other things that you can do in addition to just getting data is actually updating data. So that's usually what the post method is for. It means add an item in the REST world. So I'm using the same URL, but in this case, I'm going to do a post instead of a get. And then you actually get the body in there, which is just the string value of JSON. So you just can specify body, convert that from JSON. It converts it into a PS custom object. I can add it to my list of users and then write it back out to that file. So we're going to actually add Lee to our file. So I'm doing invoke REST method. I'm specifying the method post, same URL that I was just talking about. But I'm actually specifying a hash table, and I'm converting it to JSON to store inside of my REST API. So that invokes that, and it doesn't return anything. But if I were to invoke REST method on the user endpoint again to get the data back, you'll see now Lee has been added to that JSON file. So that's how you kind of interact with or add users to via REST. All right, so I don't want. Oh, yeah, I know what I want to do. OK, so now I want to demote Lee. So we're going to make Lee the water boy. Oh, no, I didn't copy and paste. 1 sec. Doop. All right, so a put method is usually an update. So in this case, we're calling invoke REST method with a put. I'm demoting Lee to water boy from technical product manager. Now it's actually updated that JSON file, and you can see that that role has now been changed to water boy instead of technical product manager. But now let's actually fire Lee. He didn't do very good as a water boy, so we're gonna fire Lee. So the delete method does what it states. It's going to remove that user from that JSON file, so he's no longer in there. And if you look at the implementation of this, all it's doing is it's just filtering out. Oh, not that one. It's filtering out all the users that don't match the one I just specified. So I don't want Lee to be in that list anymore. All right, so now if we check the users, you can see now Lee is gone. So REST APIs are pretty simple to do here, but it seems pretty powerful because you can integrate with all different types of systems. You could have Slack ping this through a webhook or vice versa, that kind of thing. So I know people have stood this up in their environments to collect data from all their different servers. So they'll stand up a bunch of different UD instances, these little REST APIs, and then have a centralized UD like scheduled endpoint running and collecting data from their servers. Like you could do that with WinRM or whatever, you know, but they're using HTTP via the UD REST APIs. All right, so like I said, you can also lock these down. So there's the concept of JSON web tokens, and you can kind of generate those. It's more like an API key, and then you could provide those to users of your API so that only certain people could call these APIs rather than having them open like I have them right now. All right, so there are a couple more things that I want to talk about. Yeah, so that was kind of REST APIs. Like there's some stuff there, but it's not super deep. But what is a little deep is that I want to talk a little bit about debugging, because I think one of the problems with Universal Dashboard is the way that it uses run spaces. So has anyone used like PoshRS job or PS thread job, that kind of thing, where you actually start up background run spaces? So rather than running in this like single threaded PowerShell world, what Universal Dashboard does to like increase the performance is it creates a run space pool in the background, which means you can run lots of PowerShell things at once. And because of that, it makes it really hard to debug. Like I can't just set a breakpoint in this endpoint and be like, oh, why isn't this working? You know, unfortunately, that doesn't work. And there's always issues that pop up on the forums or in GitHub. It's like, Universal Dashboard's totally broken. And then like, you know, I spend all this time debugging with this guy, and it's like, oh no, I just had a typo, sorry. You know, it's like. So that's why I wanted to like touch on this a little bit so people kind of are aware of the technique I use to actually debug. So what I actually did was I added some stuff to the PowerShell editor services to make this easier, so that if you are using VS Code, I think as of the most recent version, this functionality is actually built in there. So you can actually debug background run spaces. So I'm just going to kill this first. That's my first step, because otherwise there's going to be a huge list of run spaces. So once that starts up, we're going to start this guy up. And now, oh wait, one important thing. Okay, so let's just talk a little bit about what I have right here. So I have an element that has an endpoint, and an endpoint is just something that you know, it executes some PowerShell script, but it executes it on a background run space. Because of that, I can't debug it in Visual Studio Code like I normally would. So if I were to actually go to this page, you can see that I'm actually throwing, oh no, so if I go to that page, oh, don't I have login pages turned off? Yeah, I do. Okay. Go to the debugging page. You can see, oh no, it's like it blew up. Why? And you know, usually it's not this nice of an error. It's like, you know, this thing happened in PowerShell and we don't know why. But what you can do is you can actually use wait debugger. So wait debugger, what it does is it actually will stop and halt that PowerShell script or that run space until the debugger attaches to it. So if I were to reload this page, you can see nothing's loaded here yet. Like if I load that, nothing's loaded because it's waiting in that run space. If I use get run space, you'll see that I have two, because I reloaded it, I have two run spaces that are now in breakpoint. So they're waiting for the debugger to attach. So then what you can do is you can actually click PowerShell attach interactive session run space. So what that'll do is once I hit F5, it'll actually pop up a little drop down with all the different run spaces. You can see the numbers are kind of the same there, 2, 4, 100, 114, 115. If I select one of these busy ones, that's a little bug, is they say busy, but really they should say in breakpoint. And then I click that. What it actually does is it opens up that script in like a temporary file, and you can see that we're in that script block. So here's this little script block that I wrote, and now when I look in here, that's the exact same code. It's got the wait debugger, the oh no's, that kind of thing. And you have the same kind of debugging experience that you would have more or less in VS Code, where you have the variables on the left. You can see some of the super secret Universal Dashboard variables that are hidden in there, that kind of thing. But yeah, that's kind of the most effective way to actually debug your run spaces, because you can actually step through it like you would a regular PowerShell script. So this particular technique actually works with PoshRS job and start PS thread job. So it's not just a universal dashboard thing. Anything that uses background run spaces, you can actually do this. So if you do have thread jobs that are running and you want to debug them outside of universal dashboard, this works the same way. All right. And we're done debugging, I think. What do you do in VS Code? No. Okay. Let's kill it. Oh, no. Now it's really mad. I am just going to do this. Everyone's favorite little debugging technique. Start VS Code over. All right. One other thing I want to touch on a little bit here is endpoint initialization, because this is another thing people always get snagged up on. Is because they're background run spaces, like I was just talking about, you guys you can't use modules and variables necessarily that are included in your main PowerShell session. So you actually have to initialize those endpoints or the run spaces with new UD endpoint initialization. So you pass that into new UD dashboard. And what that does is allows you to pass in variables, functions, and modules that you want to use throughout all your endpoints. So if you want to bring in, VMware module or Azure module or something like that, you'll want to use new UD endpoint initialization and then use the module parameter to bring those into those background run spaces. Because otherwise, they're kind of pristine run spaces that don't have your profile loaded. They don't have the functions that you have defined in here. They don't have the variables you define in here. So this is kind of how you pass in those types of initialization things. Additionally, this endpoint initialization thing is just a PowerShell run or SDK class. I think it's initial session state is the name of the class. So even though new UD endpoint initialization only provides these particular things to initialize it with, you can initialize your run space with all kinds of stuff. So if I actually execute this, let's see here, and you look at endpoint initialization, it has all different kinds of crazy things that you could actually initialize this run space with. Language mode it's running in, modules, providers you have loaded, startup scripts, all that kind of stuff. So you can kind of customize that to your heart's content, and I just added a little commandlet around that to make it easier to create them rather than having to write some C#y type code. So I think if I run this, still doing that weird debugger attach thing. I don't want to run the JSON file. All right, I'm corrupt. Did you guys see, what is it called? Synthwave, the new VS Code extension? Check it out after this. I'll show you a picture. It's really cool. But when you install it, you have to do some custom CSS stuff. And now my VS Code reports that it's corrupt. So, whoops. It was a perfect thing to do right before a session. All right, so now let's try going here. And OK, so you can see my value and my functions actually came from outside the run spaces that I created. So I have this variable, my value, and get stuff returns my functions. I'm passing that in via endpoint initialization, and then I have access to that stuff here. If I didn't do that, what would happen is it would be I don't know what get stuff is, unknown command, that kind of thing. So that's kind of how you pass in more or less global functions, variables, and modules into your universal dashboard. All right. I think finally I want to touch a little on performance, because that's another question I've been getting a lot. OK, this is cool. You can do all this stuff in PowerShell, but why would I ever do this? Because it's probably going to be so slow. First off, it's definitely going to be slower than a C# web app or any compiled language. But it kind of depends what you're building. If you're building a tool for your HR team to create a user every hour or something like that, it's probably going to work fine. Just to give you a little indication of the type of performance that we see out of this is this test here. It actually starts up a UD REST API, and I'm actually calling start thread job with invoke REST method 8,000 times, I think. And it's starting that once per like processor. So I have 8 processors on here, and you can run. You see, it ran 8,000 requests in about 6 seconds. So that kind of gives you an idea of what you're looking at in terms of performance here. So it's not like, okay, I can run 100 requests a second or something like that. It's a lot more than that. So keep that in mind when you're building your dashboards, is that there definitely is a performance consideration to keep in mind here, because we are running PowerShell, and depending on how you build your dashboard, it can be better or worse performance. But this is kind of the bare minimum type of performance you'll see from an empty endpoint just calling PowerShell over and over again. Because the other thing is, it depends on what you're doing in your endpoints. So I've definitely seen people complain about Universal Dashboard when it was actually some other component that they were calling that was actually slow. So you'd have the same problem with any programming language that was doing something similar to this. All right, so that was that. And now I just want to provide some more resources for you guys. Wait, let me think about this. That's not loaded. Run it. So there are a bunch of things out there for Universal Dashboard. There is the documentation. I think I showed that already. So docs.universaldashboard.io has a bunch of stuff. It has like tons of the stuff I just went over today and more. So there's other things like theming that I didn't really go over, colors, publishing dashboards, how do you actually like stand things up, HTTPS, that kind of thing. Additionally, where did my dashboard go? Too many tabs open. There's a GitHub repository, which is this it? Yeah, so this GitHub repository, Ironman Software / Universal Dashboard file issues here. This is where all the source code is for all the stuff that I just showed off today. So if you ever want to see how certain controls are built, or complain about something, that's where you go. This is the forum, so it's forums.universaldashboard.io. Pretty active. You can see in the last hour, 2 people have asked questions. So there's lots of guys out there that are using this that are out there to answer questions. I pop on there whenever I can to help out, that kind of thing. Another cool thing on here is the show-off section. So if you're ever curious, like what are people actually building with this? There are some cool demos of people that have been building things like honey token management or honey user management, that kind of thing, where you create fake Active Directory users and check to see if people are logging in under them. I've seen some help desk dashboards. Like I always like showing this on off because it just looks really pretty. He did a really good job of making it look really nice. So he's actually doing a bunch of different help desky things with his dashboard, that kind of thing. Yeah, so go out there, check out what other people are doing, that kind of thing. Are there any other resources that I wanted to show off? Nah, that's okay. Yeah, so that kind of does it, and I want to open it up for any questions. We have about 13 minutes left, but yeah. All right, well, I'll be around, so if you have more questions you didn't want to answer right now, you don't get a sticker, but yeah, thank you.